He was seconds away from closing the biggest deal of his life when something in the room shifted, the kind of quiet shift that doesn't make a sound but changes everything. And in that moment, a man who had spent 2 decades building control over every outcome suddenly felt it slipping through his fingers as his eyes locked onto a woman he never expected to see again. A woman he once loved. A woman he thought had chosen to walk away without looking back. Now standing just a few feet away from him in a uniform that didn't match the life he believed she would have, her hands trembling slightly as she balanced a tray, her body carrying the unmistakable weight of a pregnancy he could not explain. And for a brief second, everything around him faded, the voices, the deal, the future he had been so certain of, because nothing prepares you for the moment your past shows up unannounced and forces you to confront the version of yourself you left behind. And nothing prepares you for the possibility that the life you built may have come at a cost you never fully understood until it was standing right in front of you, breathing, struggling, and refusing to be ignored. And as his grip tightened around the pen hovering over a contract worth more than most people would see in a lifetime, a single thought began to take hold, slow and heavy, refusing to let go, because the timeline didn't make sense, the distance didn't make sense. And yet the truth had a way of finding its way back no matter how far you ran from it. And in that moment, he realized that this was no coincidence. This was not chance. This was something he had been avoiding for years finally catching up to him. And the question he wasn't ready to ask began to form whether he liked it or not. Because if what he was thinking was true, then everything he believed about the past was wrong. And everything he thought he had moved on from was still very much unfinished. Because that child might be his. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. So how does a man who built his life on precision, discipline, and control find himself completely unprepared for a single moment that threatens to undo everything he thought he understood? How does someone like Grant Whitaker, a man who turned nothing into an empire, who made decisions worth millions without hesitation, suddenly hesitate when faced with a question he cannot calculate, because standing just a few feet away from him was not just a memory, not just a face from a past chapter, but Elena Carter, the one person who had once known him before the power, before the money, before the walls he carefully built around himself. And yet here she was, no longer part of his world, carrying a life that did not fit into the version of reality he had convinced himself was complete. And the more he looked at her, the more the questions refused to stay quiet, because people do not just disappear without reason. They do not walk away from something real without carrying something heavy with them. And Elena had left without explanation, without closure, without giving him the one thing he had always demanded in every part of his life: answers. And now years later, she reappeared in a place that made no sense, living a life that raised more questions than it answered, forcing him to confront the one thing he had avoided all along. Because if her presence here meant something, then it meant the past he buried was never truly gone. So why did she disappear when everything between them seemed unbreakable? Why was she now pregnant and alone? And why did her eyes carry the weight of something she had clearly been holding onto for far too long? And more importantly, what really happened between them that led to this moment where two completely different lives collided in a way neither of them could ignore? Because the truth, as Grant was beginning to realize, was far more complicated than anyone expected. Long before the contracts, the tailored suits, and the rooms filled with people waiting on his decisions, Grant Whitaker was just a man trying to outrun the limitations he was born into. A man who understood early that nothing would be handed to him, that every opportunity had to be taken, shaped, and secured with relentless focus. And over time that belief became the foundation of everything he built. A mindset that left little room for uncertainty or emotion, because in his world, outcomes were earned through discipline, not chance, and he carried that principle into every deal, every risk, every relationship, telling himself again and again that luck had nothing to do with success, only decisions. And for a long time, that belief worked exactly as he intended, until he met Elena Carter, a woman who did not care about his ambition in the way others did, who was not impressed by potential or promises, but by who he was when there was nothing to show for it. And that was something Grant had never encountered before, someone who could see past the drive, past the ambition, and recognize the parts of him he rarely allowed anyone else to access. And for reasons he could not fully explain, he stayed, not because it made sense, but because with her, for the first time, everything felt less like a transaction and more like something real, something steady, something he did not need to control. Their relationship was not built in comfort. It was built in uncertainty, in long nights filled with plans that had no guarantees, in moments where belief was the only thing holding them together. And for a while, that was enough, because Elena believed in him before there was anything to believe in. And Grant, in his own way, relied on that more than he ever admitted. But as the years passed and the success he chased finally began to take shape, something shifted, not suddenly, not in a way that could be pointed to in a single moment, but gradually, quietly. As his focus narrowed and his time became more valuable, his priorities began to change. And the same determination that once brought them closer started creating distance between them. Because the more he gained, the less present he became. And Alina noticed it long before he did. She saw the way conversations turned into brief exchanges, the way promises were replaced with delays, the way he convinced himself that everything he was doing was for their future while slowly becoming absent from the present. And still she stayed, not because it was easy, but because she understood him in a way few people ever would. She knew what drove him, what he feared, what he refused to face. And for a long time, she accepted the version of him that came with it. But toward the end, something changed in her as well. Not in a dramatic way, not with arguments or confrontations, but in silence in the spaces between their conversations, in the moments where she seemed present but distant at the same time, as if she was carrying something she could not bring herself to share. And Grant noticed it, even if he chose not to fully acknowledge it. He saw the subtle shift, the way she hesitated before speaking, the way her eyes lingered on him like she was trying to remember something slipping away. And when he asked, she gave him just enough to move past it, never enough to explain it. And that was something he would later come to regret, because the signs were there, the distance, the quiet withdrawal, the sense that something was unfolding beneath the surface. But he was too focused on everything ahead of him to stop and question what was happening right in front of him. And then one day, without warning, without a conversation that could offer clarity or closure, she was gone. No long explanation, no final argument, just an absence that replaced everything they had built. And just like that, Elena Carter disappeared from his life as if she had never been part of it at all, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions and a version of the truth that never quite felt complete. And for years, Grant told himself the same thing over and over again, that she had made her choice, that whatever reason she had for leaving was hers alone, that it was something he no longer needed to understand. But standing there now, watching her struggle just to remain steady, carrying a life he could not ignore, he was beginning to realize that the story he accepted all those years ago may have only been a small part of something much bigger, because what happened between them was not as simple as he once believed, and whatever truth she walked away with, she had never truly left it behind. But that wasn't the full story. The moment stretched longer than it should have, as if time itself hesitated to move forward, because Grant Whitaker was no longer seeing the restaurant the way everyone else was. He wasn't hearing the quiet conversations or the clinking glasses or the soft music playing in the background. All of it faded into something distant and unimportant as his attention fixed entirely on Elena Carter, standing across the room in a way that felt almost unreal, like something his mind was trying to piece together, but couldn't quite accept, because the woman he remembered carried herself with a quiet confidence, a calm presence that never needed attention. Yet the woman in front of him now looked different in ways that couldn't be ignored, not just because of the uniform or the environment, but because of the weight she carried both physically and emotionally, her movements careful, measured, as if every step required more effort than it should, and still she kept moving, balancing a tray that looked heavier than it had any right to be, her fingers tightening around its edge as though letting go was not an option she could afford. She hadn't seen him yet, or maybe she had and was choosing not to acknowledge it, because there was a deliberate distance in the way she moved, a quiet attempt to remain unnoticed, to blend into a room that was not built for someone like her. And yet the more she tried to disappear, the more impossible it became for him to look away, because nothing about this made sense, not the setting, not the situation, and certainly not the reality that the one person he had convinced himself was firmly in his past was now standing just a few feet away, living a life that raised more questions than answers. And as he watched her, something shifted again, something that had nothing to do with logic or reason, but everything to do with a feeling he could not ignore, the kind that settles in slowly and refuses to be dismissed, because part of him, the part he had spent years silencing, recognized that this was not just coincidence. This was something unfinished demanding to be seen. The tension in the room sharpened when a voice cut through the air, louder than it needed to be, directed straight at her. A manager whose impatience was clear in every word, criticizing her pace, her focus, her ability to keep up. And Elena didn't respond the way most would. She didn't argue, didn't defend herself. She simply nodded, adjusted her grip, and kept moving as though she had learned long ago that some battles were not worth the energy. But the pressure showed in the smallest details. In the way her shoulders tightened, in the way her steps became slightly unsteady, and then for a brief second, the tray tilted just enough to draw attention, just enough for a few nearby guests to glance in her direction, their expressions shifting from indifference to quiet judgment. And in that moment, something inside Grant reacted before he could stop it, because this was not the version of her he knew, this was not the life he had imagined for her. And the disconnect between what he believed and what he was seeing became impossible to ignore. Part of him wanted to look away, to return to the table, to sign the contract, to continue with the life he had built without interruption, because that was what he had trained himself to do, to move forward without hesitation, without distraction. But something didn't feel right, something deeper than curiosity, something that refused to be dismissed as coincidence. And before he could fully think it through, before logic had the chance to intervene, he found himself standing. His focus no longer on the deal, no longer on the people waiting for his decision, but entirely on her, closing the distance that felt much larger than it actually was, until he was close enough to say the one thing he hadn't said in years. Elena. The name left his mouth with more weight than he expected, and for a moment everything stopped because she heard it. There was no mistaking that. Her body reacted instantly, freezing in place as though the sound itself had reached further than just her ears, as though it had pulled her back into something she had tried to leave behind. And slowly, carefully, she turned to face him, and the silence that followed was louder than anything in the room, louder than the conversations, louder than the music, louder than the expectations hanging over him just moments ago, because in that silence was everything neither of them had said, everything that had been left unresolved, everything that time had not erased no matter how far apart their lives had gone. For a brief second, neither of them spoke, because some moments do not allow for immediate answers. They demand acknowledgement first. They demand the courage to face what is standing right in front of you without the protection of distance or denial. And when she finally did speak, her voice was quieter than he remembered, steady but carrying something beneath it that he couldn't quite place, something that suggested this moment was not as simple as it appeared. "You shouldn't be here." The words didn't make sense, not in the way he expected, not in the way this encounter should have unfolded, because if anything, she was the one out of place in his world, not the other way around. And yet the certainty in her voice suggested something else entirely, something that shifted the situation from coincidence to something far more intentional. And it was then, as his eyes moved instinctively, taking in the details he had been too overwhelmed to fully process before, that the reality of her condition became impossible to ignore, The curve of her pregnancy no longer something his mind could question or reinterpret. It was there, undeniable, present in a way that demanded explanation. And immediately, the timeline began to unravel in his thoughts. The years since she left, the absence of any contact, the impossibility of aligning what he knew with what he was seeing, because nothing about it added up, not logically, not rationally. And yet the more he tried to dismiss it, the stronger the question became, pressing against everything he thought he understood, forcing its way into the forefront of his mind, whether he was ready for it or not. And that's when the question hit him, not suddenly, but with a slow, undeniable weight that made it impossible to ignore. A question that carried implications he was not prepared to face. Because if there was even the slightest chance that what he was thinking was true, then it meant the past he had accepted was incomplete. It meant the decisions he had justified might have been based on something he never fully understood. And most of all, it meant that the life standing in front of him might be connected to him in a way he had never considered. And that was a question he wasn't ready to ask. The conversation ended far too quickly for something that carried that much weight, because Elena Carter did not stay long enough to explain herself, and Grant Whitaker did not push. Not because he didn't want answers, but because he could already feel that whatever truth existed between them was not something that would be handed to him in a single moment. And as she walked away, returning to a life that clearly did not match the one he had imagined for her, he remained standing there longer than he should have, the deal forgotten, the voices around him meaningless, because for the first time in years, he was no longer certain of the story he had told himself about the past. And when uncertainty enters a mind that has spent years operating on certainty, it does not sit quietly. It demands resolution. It demands clarity. And Grant was not the kind of man who could ignore something once it reached that level. So he did what he had always done when faced with something he could not immediately understand. He began to look deeper, not emotionally, but methodically, because that was the only way he knew how to process anything that did not make sense. Within days, he had people working on it, quiet professionals who knew how to find information that others could not, individuals who understood discretion as well as they understood detail, and Elena Carter's name, a name that had been absent from his life for years, suddenly became the center of a search that stretched further than he expected, because the first thing they discovered was that she had not stayed in one place. She had moved more than once, shifting between cities in a pattern that did not suggest stability or comfort, but rather someone trying to stay ahead of something, or perhaps someone trying not to be found. And the more they looked, the more unusual it became, because her work history told a story of someone capable of much more than the position she held, jobs that required long hours and offered little in return, environments that did not align with the woman he remembered, and yet she stayed in them, moving from one to another without any clear progression, as though she was not building a future but simply maintaining the present. And then there were the gaps, the missing records, the absence of things that should have been easy to find, especially when it came to medical history, because for someone in her condition, there should have been consistency, regular visits, documented care. But instead there were long stretches where nothing appeared at all, as though she had deliberately chosen to remain outside of systems designed to track exactly that. And it was in those gaps that the questions began to grow louder. At first, Grant considered the simplest explanation, that there was someone else, someone who had been part of her life during those years, someone who could explain the pregnancy, the distance, the reason she never reached out. And for a moment, that idea almost made sense because it was easier to accept, easier to place the past into a category that required no further examination. But the more the details came in, the less that theory held together because there was no consistent presence. No name that appeared repeatedly, no evidence of a relationship that could explain the kind of life she had been living. And then there were small, inconsistent financial traces, deposits that appeared irregularly, not enough to suggest support, but enough to raise questions, and even those could not be traced to a clear source. leaving behind a pattern that felt incomplete, as though pieces of the story were deliberately missing, and the more he tried to fit them together, the more he realized that nothing added up in a way that made sense, not logically, not practically, and certainly not in a way that aligned with the version of events he had accepted years ago. And as the investigation continued, something unexpected began to happen, because the more he learned about where she had been, the more his own memories began to shift. Moments he had once dismissed as insignificant started to carry a different weight, conversations that ended too quickly, silences that lasted too long, decisions he made without fully understanding their impact. And for the first time, he allowed himself to revisit those moments not as someone who had moved on, but as someone who might have missed something important, something that had been right in front of him at the time but went unnoticed because he was too focused on everything else. And that realization settled in slowly, not as a sudden conclusion, but as a growing awareness that whatever happened between them had not been as simple as he once believed, that there were layers to it he had never taken the time to uncover, and that perhaps the answers he was searching for now had always been there, just overlooked. And it was in the middle of that realization that the call came in, not urgent, not dramatic, but carrying a level of significance that was immediately clear the moment he heard the tone on the other end. What they found next was not something buried in a system or hidden behind records that required effort to access. It was something far more personal, something that had been kept out of reach not because it was impossible to find, but because no one had thought to look for it in the right place. A document tied to a time he remembered clearly, a period just before Elena disappeared. And when it was finally placed in front of him, when he saw the date, the details, the connection to a moment he had long since categorized as unimportant, everything shifted in a way he could not ignore. Because this was not just information, this was context, this was explanation, this was the first piece of something that had been incomplete for years finally falling into place. And as he began to understand what it meant, as the implications became impossible to dismiss, one thing became clear above everything else. The past he thought he understood had never been complete. And whatever truth Elena had walked away with, it was far more significant than he had ever imagined. And that's when everything changed. By the time Grant Whitaker asked to see Elena Carter again, the weight of everything he had uncovered was no longer something he could ignore or rationalize away, because the document he held in his hand had already begun to rewrite the version of the past he had carried for years. And now, he needed to hear the rest of it from the only person who had lived through it with him, not as a businessman searching for answers, but as a man finally willing to confront the truth he had avoided. And when they sat across from each other again, this time without the noise of a crowded room or the pressure of watching eyes, there was a stillness between them that felt different from before, not uncertain, but heavy with everything that had yet to be said. And for a moment neither of them spoke, because some truths take time to surface, not because they are hidden, but because they require the right moment to be faced without distraction or denial. Elena did not begin with explanations or justifications. She began with something simpler, something that carried more weight than any defense could. She acknowledged that leaving without a word had not been fair, that disappearing the way she did had created a version of the story that left him with more questions than answers. But what she said next was not an apology. It was the truth he had never considered, because at the time when everything between them seemed uncertain, when his career was at a point where one wrong move could cost him everything he had spent years building, she had found herself connected to something she did not fully understand at first, something tied to a deal, a partnership, people who operated in ways that did not leave room for mistakes. And the deeper it went, the clearer it became that Grant's name was being pulled into something that could destroy him before he even had the chance to see it coming. And she had a choice. A choice that did not feel like one at all, because staying meant risking everything he had worked for, and leaving meant carrying the burden alone without any guarantee that it would make a difference. She chose to leave, not because she stopped believing in him, but because she believed in him enough to step away before the consequences reached him. She cut herself out of his life completely, removed every connection that could trace back to him, and made sure that whatever followed her would not follow him as well. And she did it knowing that he would not understand, knowing that he would see it as abandonment rather than protection. But she accepted that because in her mind, it was the only way to ensure that he could continue forward without being pulled into something he could not control. And for years, she carried that decision without explanation, without recognition, because some choices are made not to be understood, but to be necessary. Grant listened without interruption, not because he had nothing to say, but because for the first time, he realized how little he had known about what was happening at the time, how much he had assumed based on what was visible, and how much he had missed because he was too focused on everything outside of what mattered most. And as that realization settled in, there was another truth he could no longer avoid, one that had been present from the moment he saw her again. One that had followed him through every piece of information he uncovered, and when he finally asked, when the question he had been holding back could no longer remain unspoken, the answer came without hesitation because it had never changed. The child was his. She told him she found out after she had already left, after the decision had been made and there was no clear way to return without undoing everything she had tried to protect. And in that moment, she made another choice, one that carried just as much weight as the first. She chose not to tell him, not because she didn't think he deserved to know, but because at that point, his life had already moved forward, his success had begun to take shape. And bringing that truth into it would have forced him into a position where he would have to choose between everything he had worked for and something he never saw coming. And she could not be the reason he lost it all after everything he had sacrificed to build it. So she carried that truth alone as well, through every city she moved to, through every job she took, through every moment that required more strength than she should have needed. And when she looked at him now, there was no expectation in her eyes. No demand for anything to change, only the quiet acceptance of the path she had chosen and the consequences that came with it. I didn't tell you, because you finally had everything you worked for. The words settled between them in a way that could not be undone, because in that moment, everything Grant believed about success, about control, about the decisions that shaped his life, began to shift. Not dramatically, but deeply, in a way that reached beyond logic and into something far more difficult to reconcile. Because the very thing he had spent years building had been protected by a sacrifice he never knew was made, a sacrifice that cost him more than he realized. And as that understanding took hold, there was nothing immediate he could say, no response that could balance what had just been revealed, only silence, the kind that forces you to sit with the weight of something that cannot be changed. And in that silence came realization, not just of what had happened, but of what it meant, because for the first time, he was not looking at the past as something finished. He was seeing it for what it truly was, something incomplete, something shaped by choices he did not fully understand until now, and something that had been waiting all this time to be seen for what it really was. The truth did not bring the kind of relief Grant Whitaker thought it would, because clarity, when it arrives too late, does not fix what has already been broken. It only reveals how long it has been that way. And as he sat there across from Elena Carter, hearing the full weight of everything she had carried alone, there was an unfamiliar stillness in him, not the calculated calm he used in business, but something quieter, something heavier, because for the first time, he was not thinking about solutions or outcomes. He was thinking about time, the years that had passed, the moments that could not be revisited, the decisions that could not be undone, and the realization that everything he had built had come with a cost he had never stopped to measure. And now that cost was sitting right in front of him, not as a concept, but as a reality he could not ignore. He tried to fix it in the only way he knew how, by offering stability, by offering support, by trying to create a path forward that made sense within the life he had built. Because that was how he had always solved problems. He found a way to restore balance, to bring order back into something that felt uncertain. But this was not a situation that could be approached the same way, because Elena was not asking for anything. She was not looking for a solution. She was not waiting for him to step in and change what had already been lived. And when he spoke about starting over, about making things right, about being present now in a way he had not been before, she listened, not with resistance, but with an understanding that made it clear she had already thought through those possibilities long before he had. And when she responded, it was not with anger or blame, but with a quiet certainty that carried more weight than either of those could. Too much time had passed, too much had changed, and some things once broken by absence and silence do not return to what they once were, no matter how much you want them to, because trust is not only about what was done, but also about what was not done, the moments that were missed, the presence that was never there, and she had learned to move forward without him, not because she wanted to, but because she had to, and now that he was here, now that he finally understood what had happened. It did not erase the years she spent building a life in his absence. It did not undo the reality she had created for herself, and for the child she had chosen to raise on her own. And while she did not shut him out, while she did not deny him the opportunity to be part of their child's life, she also did not allow herself to return to something that no longer existed in the same way it once had. Grant accepted that, not immediately, not easily, but in the only way he could, by recognizing that this was not about reclaiming the past. It was about understanding it and moving forward with a truth he had not known before. And in that understanding, he chose to be present, not as someone trying to rewrite history, but as someone willing to take responsibility for what came next, supporting her, supporting the child, not out of obligation, but out of a realization that some roles in life are not given at the right time. They are discovered too late and must be carried forward regardless of when they begin. And while their relationship never returned to what it once was, it evolved into something shaped by honesty, something that acknowledged both what was lost and what still remained. And in that quiet, complicated space between regret and acceptance, Grant began to see his life differently, not as a series of achievements, but as a series of choices that carried consequences beyond what he had ever allowed himself to consider. Because in the end, success had given him everything he thought he wanted, the influence, the control, the security, but it had taken something in return, something he never realized he was losing until it was standing in front of him, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply existing as a reminder of what could have been if he had chosen differently. And that realization stayed with him, not as something that could be resolved, but as something that would always be part of the way he saw the world from that point on. A quiet understanding that no amount of success can replace the things that are only present when you choose to be there for them. And sometimes, by the time you understand what truly matters, it's already too late. And when you look at Grant Whitaker's story now, when you really take a moment to think about everything that happened between him and Elena Carter, it stops being just a story about success or loss, and it starts to feel a lot more personal. Because at some point in life, almost everyone faces a moment where they have to choose between what is in front of them and what truly matters, and not everyone realizes the weight of that choice until much later, when the opportunity to choose differently is no longer there. And that is what makes this story stay with you, not the money, not the status, but the quiet realization that some of the most important things in life do not demand attention. They simply wait. And if you are too focused elsewhere, you may not notice what you are losing until it is already gone. So the question becomes unavoidable, not just for Grant, but for anyone watching. What would you have done in his position? Would you have tried to fix the past once you finally understood the truth? Or would you accept it for what it is and focus on what still remains? And more importantly, have you ever lost something important because you were too focused on everything else? Let me know in the comments. I read every single one, and if this story stayed with you, subscribe for more.